you are probably not as familiar with as you should be. And so I promise that this hour will be well spent and you will come away from it with a much richer understanding of who God is and how God lives, works, and moves through us. We are delighted to have you with us this Martin Luther King weekend. It is our joy at Transfiguration to partner together with our friends over at Good Shepherd to bring Dr. Brown here, and we are delighted to have you with us today. So welcome to you all.
Thank you very much for being part of this with us, Casey. This has been a great build-up, and I'm really looking forward to what we have coming in the next hour. The past year, of course, has brought us an increased awareness of the burden of race-based discrimination that so many of our fellow countrymen and fellow Christians bear. It's also brought what seems to be a correlative rise in tensions around issues of race and power and privilege. As Christians, thinking about Jesus and his response to the oppressed and the way the oppressed see and respond to Jesus, and what this has to do with politics and power and violence seem to be the order of the day, which means that the teaching of Howard Thurman could not be more timely. I want to say again, thank you to the people at Spiritual Ministries Institute. SMI and the Church of the Transfiguration are great partners in this event, and we are glad to be part of this with you. We also want to welcome all the people who are joining us today, whether you're from Transfiguration or Good Shepherd or our friends at the Renovari Book Club or people around our country. We are particularly grateful to have Dr. Loretta Coleman Brown as our leader and guide this afternoon. Dr. Brown is a retired distinguished professor of psychology at Agnes Scott College, a graduate of the Shalem Institute for Spiritual Formation, a writer, a retreat leader, a spiritual director, and a nationally recognized speaker. Professor Brown promotes a contemplative spirituality, but it is her work on the living wisdom of Howard Thurman that brings us together today. Dr. Brown, welcome to our churches in Dallas. We are really looking forward to what you bring us today.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, the Reverend Casey Shobe and the Reverend Michael Mills of Good Shepherd. I am just so delighted to be with all of you today and to share with you some information and some teaching about my favorite mentor, Howard Washington Thurman, his life, his writings, his influence on American religion and spirituality, as well as his influence on the civil rights movement and social justice. I think he really serves as an exemplar for the inextricable links between spirituality and individual and social transformation. And so today I'm just going to provide you with what I would consider to be a little taste of Howard Thurman. They teach classes, semester-long classes on his work and his writings and his teachings. And so we're just going to hit what I sometimes like to call the highlight reel of talking about him in this hour. Now, before I begin, I would like to start with a prayer. I have a PowerPoint here that I'd like to share with you all. And Howard Thurman wrote many meditations, particularly for his church that he founded in San Francisco, as well as his time at the Marsh Chapel at Boston University. And so today we're going to begin with one of his meditations. And so what I'd really like to honor his contemplative spirit is for you to just relax, listen to his words. I'm going to give us a minute of silence afterwards so that we can just absorb what's been said.
How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see one's self pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings, with noisy silences, while something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still moment and the resting love. With full intensity, we seek ere the quiet passes a fresh sense of order in our living, a direction, a strong, sure purpose that will structure our confusion and bring meaning in our chaos. We look at ourselves in this waiting moment, the kinds of people we are. The questions persist. What are we doing with our lives? What are the motives that order our days? What is the end of our doings? Where are we trying to go? Where do we put the emphasis? And where are our values focused? For what end do we make sacrifices? Where is my treasure? And what do I love most in life? What do I hate most in life? And to what am I true? Over and over, the questions beat in upon the waiting moment as we listen, floating up through all the jangling echoes of our turbulence. There is a sound of another kind, a deeper note which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being. We wait. Our questions are answered. Our spirits refreshed. And we move back into the traffic of our daily round with the peace of the eternal in our step. How good it is to center down.
Amen. So you will see, or I should say you will hear at points today, a gender bias in the language of Howard Thurman. He, of course, was writing these meditations and much of his work in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so in each of his books is this statement on gender bias, that he certainly was very gifted and prophetic, but he was also a product of his times. And in many of the recorded meditations and recitations, there has not been a shift in that language. So I was drawn to the work of Howard Thurman because I was finishing my program on spiritual direction at the Shalem Institute. And I was looking around for someone who might be able to address some of my own contemplative roots, as well as some of the issues that I was facing with some of my directees. And I thought about whether or not I had encountered in my studies African-American or African mystic. And I started asking around and someone said, well, haven't you heard of Howard Thurman? And I hadn't heard of Howard Thurman. This was really late in my academic career. And I couldn't believe as a highly educated person that I had never heard of this man. But what I found when I did discover him was that we shared, although maybe 50 years apart, this desire for silence and solitude and stillness and connection with nature. And I was just immediately drawn to his work and his wisdom and the ways in which he incorporated that into a kind of social justice work as well as social activism. So he as some people might have described, is sort of like an ordinary mystic. That is, typically we associate the mystics with religious communities and people who have been ensconced into monasteries and convents. But he was actually a person growing up in a neighborhood like everybody else, but having these very mystical experiences as a young child. So he's born on November 18th, 1899, near West Palm Beach, but grew up in Daytona Beach. And by the way, you will get a copy of this timeline. It will be sent to you, along with a bibliography, extended bibliography, and a couple of his meditations. And as a young boy, and this is, by the way, his house that is still standing in Daytona Beach, Florida. He was drawn to the contemplative life himself. And he said that, I just want to read just this quote really quickly. I was a very sensitive child who suffered much from the violences of racial conflict. The climate of our town, Daytona Beach, was better than most Southern towns because of the influence of the tourists who wintered there. Nevertheless, life became more and more suffocating because of the fear of being brutalized, beaten, or otherwise outraged. In my effort to keep this fear from corroding my life and making me seek relief in shiftlessness, I sought help from God. I found that the more I turned to prayer, to what I discovered in later years to be meditation, the more time I spent alone in the woods or on the beach, the freer became my own spirit, and the more realistic became my ambitions to get an education. So basically, Thurman started turning to God at a very early age and meditating in the early 1900s, which is just amazing. And as a young boy, he described some of the mystical experiences that he had outside, with the ocean, nearby the ocean. And he, talks about the storms coming up over the ocean. And he says, the experience of these storms gave me a certain overriding immunity against much of the pain with which I would have to deal with in the years ahead when the ocean was only a memory. The sense held, I felt rooted in life, in nature, in all of existence. And so basically, he spent a lot of time outdoors. And he says even other things such as, I had the sense that all things, the sand, the sea, the stars, the night, and I were one lung through which all of life breathed. Not only was I aware of a vast rhythm enveloping all, I was a part of it, and it was a part of me. So one of the things I want to note right off is that Howard Thurman was having, as a young boy, was having these mystical and contemplative experiences, and they occurred in nature. They were not necessarily in a church. That is not to say, as he mentions later on in his life, that you can't have, and he really referred to them later as, religious experience, that you can't have those in other places. But his began outside. He also had a special oak tree. Now, this is actually a picture of the oak tree during his time. And he actually began to talk with this tree. He said, it held its ground, rooted in life and nature and existence. I needed the strength of that tree. And he would sometimes, sort of share some of his issues and problems with the tree. And he said, I could talk aloud to the oak tree and know that it understood. It too was part of my reality, like the woods. And it was one of my earliest companions. The other thing is that he often took lessons from the things he discovered in nature. So for example, he noticed that when these storms came up, that the tree might bend, but rarely did it break. And he said there was a constancy that was not subject to tempest, but whatever it would not be outside of a person, but with his spirit. So he really had some experiences as a young boy that immediately connected him to God. In addition, he lost his father at age 7. And that was in fact a very traumatic event. He actually was in the room when his father died of pneumonia. He also was traumatized by the fact that the local church that his grandmother and mother attended would not allow his father's funeral there, to officiate the funeral, because his father was actually more of an intellectual man and not necessarily a religious man. And so they refused to officiate his funeral because they said he had died outside of Christ. There was a visiting preacher who said that he would actually officiate at the funeral, but took that opportunity to condemn his father to hell for not being a churchgoer. And at one point, Howard Thurman said he was never going to go to church again and didn't want to have anything to do with church. But of course, because he was having these experiences, religious experiences with God, that didn't last very long. In addition to the fact that he remembered that there was something about this religion that his mother and grandmother had embraced that seemed to kick people out if they didn't go to church regularly. Now, one of the great influences on his life after his father passed away was his grandmother, Nancy. His mother had to work, and so she spent time at home with his older sister and himself. And she was quite an extraordinary woman. She had been a slave. And she would tell them the story about a preacher coming about once a year. A slave preacher was allowed to preach on the plantation. And he would just basically tell them after he finished his sermon, and he'd look at each one of them individually and say, now I want you to remember, you are not slaves. You are not the N-word. You are holy children of God. And it was this message that they were holy children of God that she held on to and helped her to survive slavery. She also passed this message on to Howard Thurman and his siblings whenever they started to look like that they were getting discouraged because of their second-class citizenship in the Jim Crow South of the early 1900s. So basically, Howard Thurman was a very bright young man. He finished the 7 grades of school that he could. That was all that was allowed for colored children at that time. But because he was so smart, the community got together and had him privately tutored through the 8th grade so that he could actually go to the Florida Baptist Academy. And of course, he graduated valedictorian from there. He also went on from there to Morehouse College, and it's said that he probably read every book in the library that they had. And then he goes on and graduates valedictorian, and then of course goes to now Colgate Rochester Theological Seminary, and also graduated there from as valedictorian. And as he's leaving that place, one of his professors that he worked with, George Cross, said, you know, you're such a brilliant young man, and I hope that you really won't allow the sort of Negro problem to consume you, that I think you have the talent to address the hunger of the human spirit. And of course, that invitation presented quite a dilemma for him, because on one hand, he was brilliant and he had wonderful ideas and great things, potential to develop. But at the same time, he knew and he could see from the environment that he was in that there were people who were suffering because of the situation that they were in. And so this certainly had an influence on him. And then he received his first picture of him as a young man. He received his first job at the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Oberlin, Ohio. And one night he was actually attending a meeting and he got bored and he sort of walked out and he found this book on a table. It was called Finding the Trail of Life. It had been written by Quaker mystic Rufus Jones. And he was so enthralled with this book that he said, you know, I've got to go work with this person. I've got to go study with them. And somehow or other, he was able to arrange, even though he was not a student at Haverford College, he was able to arrange a semester study with Rufus Jones. Now, Rufus Jones was, of course, part of the tradition, the Quaker mystical tradition, which is obviously different from the traditional monastic mystical tradition. And so he had very different ideas in some ways, or he presented different ideas to Howard Thurman. That's not to say that in his study, that he did not study all the classic mystics like, you know, Meister Eckhart and Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John the Cross, but that he had this additional introduction to the Quaker way of looking at life, which was in part, you know, this divinity within, the light within, and he basically began to think about the relationship between sort of inner life and outer life. So he was very much influenced by this time. And he mentions that he had an opportunity to attend a Quaker meeting of silence. And I just want to read what he said here about that experience. He did it more than once, but this particular experience, he says, nobody said a word, just silence, silence, just more silence. And in that silence, I felt as though all of them were on one side and I was on the other side by myself with my noise. And every time I would try to get across the barrier, nothing happened. I was just Howard Thurman. And then, I don't know when it happened, how it happened. I wish I could tell you, but somewhere in that hour, I passed over the invisible line and I became one with all the seekers. I wasn't Howard Thurman anymore. I was a human spirit involved in a creative moment with human spirits in the presence of God. So he really was not only a natural contemplative and a person that we might describe as a mystic, not to say that he would necessarily describe himself as a mystic, but he certainly had these desires and inclinations for quiet. I'm going to play next another one of his meditations. So if you'll just, wherever you are, just take a deep breath, relax, close your eyes maybe, and listen to what he has to say.
In quietness and confidence shall be your strength. Long before I was born, God was at work, creating life, nature, and the world of men and things. The worlds were ideas in the mind of God that have been realizing themselves through the ages. God is not through with creation. God is not through with me. In quietness and confidence shall be my strength. Acquaint now thyself with him and be at peace. In many ways, I'm getting acquainted with myself. Always I seek a deeper understanding of my true self, the very core of me. What I would be and am not yet reassures me. Through my innermost self, I find my way to God. I shall acquaint myself with Him and be at peace. I will fly in the greatness of God as the marsh hen flies, filling all the space twixt the marsh and the skies. What I seek beyond is what I am finding within. The beyond is within. The signature of God is all around me, in the rocks, in the trees, in the minds of men. I will fly in the greatness of God as the marsh hen flies. I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. I can never be overcome by evil until the evil that threatens moves from without within. This does not mean that I shall not be hurt by evil, shall not be frustrated by evil, that I shall say that evil is not evil. I shall see the travel of my own life with evil and be unafraid. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they will comfort me.
Amen. So after spending time studying with Rufus Jones, Howard Thurman went to Morehouse Spelman College, spent a couple of years there. And then he was invited to join the faculty and become the Dean of the Rackham Chapel at Howard University. And in that time, in the 30s, early 30s, he began thinking about what Christianity had to offer. And so he initially published a essay called Good News for the Underprivileged in 1935. Within that time, however, he was invited to lead a pilgrimage to India. And the idea basically was that they were having some difficulty in India, basically introducing Christianity and helping it to sort of spread. And so they thought that maybe if they could get some people that looked kind of Indian or people of color to come, that would help. Howard Thurman, of course, said, look, I'm not going to India to proselytize and Christianity. So, but I will come and talk about the issues that Negroes were having here in the United States in hopes of helping the Indians there who were dealing with the British occupation at the time. And so and there's actually a book just on this pilgrimage, which is a lovely book called Visions of a Better World. And During one of his first visits, he actually encounters a lawyer at one of the universities that they stop at. And by the way, they were there for 6 months, and they gave just a ton of lectures on a variety of topics. And so this, I'm not sure if he was a dean or just a lawyer, asked him if he would have some tea and conversation. And he basically asked him, "What are you doing over here? Like, you know, I don't understand why you're over here as a person representing Christianity. I mean," he said, "you live in a Christian nation in which you are segregated, lynched, and burned. You will pardon me, sir, I do not wish to seem rude or disrespectful to you as a visitor in our midst, but I think any Black Christian is either a fool or a dupe." And so Thurman actually was not insulted. He was in fact moved by this gentleman's frankness, and he said that he agreed and he didn't think that his critique had actually gone far enough. But he did make at that moment his distinction between Christianity and the religion of Jesus. He said, "I am a Christian because I think the religion of Jesus in its true genius offers me very many ways out of the world's disorders." He noted that Jesus's message was not one limited to Christianity or Christians, because in some ways he felt that it was much broader than that, and that, and he didn't really sort of say it this way, but he said that something happened to the message of Jesus. Because it had turned into be, in some ways, a religion that allowed the stronger to exploit the weak. He enjoyed this conversation because he felt like these sustained conversations between people from different races or different nationalities or different positions are what actually helped to transform society. So on this trip, he was also able to spend some time with, in a meeting with Gandhi. And this was really one of those providential situations. Of course, they had been trying to get Gandhi to come to the United States, but they were afraid that if he came, he would be assassinated. And so this was a great opportunity for them to get together. Gandhi was very interested in meeting Thurman. Thurman was interested in meeting him. They had a number of problems. At first, Gandhi was sick, and then they were exhausted. But finally, in the last few, like the last week before they were supposed to come back to the United States, they got a telegram and they were able to meet for about 3 or 4 hours. Gandhi had lots of questions for Thurman about American Negroes, about whether the prejudice was getting better or worse, voting rights, discrimination, interracial marriage, lynching, public school education. So basically, Thurman gave Gandhi what we would call a Negro history lesson for that time. And then they had a discussion about whether Christianity or Islam would be the better religion for Negroes. Because Gandhi's point was that, at least in Islam, unlike Hinduism and Buddhism, you know, once you're in the religion, whether you are a slave or master, you're the same. So it was a real interesting conversation that went back and forth. Of course, they talked about ahimsa, which is nonviolence, and satyagraha, which is civil disobedience. And basically, Gandhi said, "I'm not even sure if I'm happy with the word nonviolence, that what I'm talking about in terms of ahimsa is really the ultimate force of love," which he thought was really underlined and defined all of reality. And so basically, they continued this conversation, and they both agreed that without the quest for spiritual development, genuine social change becomes impossible. Gandhi encouraged Thurman to be a living sermon, to start with small actions of resistance, and, you know, to then perhaps maybe, you know, begin to gather other people into a possible movement. And so before leaving, Sue Bailey Thurman and the other couple, by the way, that accompanied him on this pilgrimage, Gandhi wanted them to sing some spirituals. So they sang, "Were you there to crucify my Lord?" emphasizing the healing of the suffering. And "We are climbing Jacob's ladder," to emphasize the hope. And then there were these famous last words after taking some silence. That was their sort of benediction. Gandhi says to Thurman, "Well, if it comes true, it may be through the Negroes that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world." So this moment was extraordinary, and it's extraordinary for me too, because I grew up thinking that it was Martin Luther King Jr. who went to India and learned nonviolence and came back, but it was actually Thurman in the 1930s who actually sat down with Gandhi and had this meeting and brought the message of civil disobedience and nonviolence to the United States in this way. Now, while he was there in the last few days, he had a vision at Khyber Pass where he saw this caravan going into Afghanistan, and he felt like those people in that caravan were his people. And so it ignited this desire in him to create a congregation that transcended social and racial divisions. Shortly, about maybe 5 or 7 years after that, he was invited to join with Alfred Fisk to start the first intentional interracial church in San Francisco called the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples. And so he leaves his position at Howard University to begin that experiment in some ways. During that time, he also begins to write and give lectures on the significance of Jesus. He writes a series of them, all the while beginning to pull all these ideas together for his book that will really change the course of American history, Jesus and the Disinherited. And it's clear that I'm not going to have time to go through all of Jesus and the Disinherited, sort of its bits and parts. But let me just say, I think it's a book everybody should read. Doesn't matter who you are, where you live in the world. It is one of those kind of classics. And it has a lot to say about, what is it that oppressed people, disinherited people, dispossessed people, why would they want to convert to Christianity? What does it offer people who have their backs against the wall? Was there really anything in the message of Jesus that could help them? So he basically continues to work on this sort of distinction between the religion of Jesus and Christianity. And he begins this book by really talking about the differences between Jesus and Paul and why they may have very different perspectives on the world, and why their approaches and ideas about the world might be different. He also, and I mean, his point basically is that Jesus was a poor Jew that could have just been kicked to the curb and he would not have had any rights whatsoever. And Paul was actually a Roman citizen, and so he could have actually, in some ways, appealed to the state. But his intent for this book was really to give some courage and some sense of dignity to those who were feeling like they were on the margins, definitely the margins of the society. He thought about his grandmother and about how she was able to survive slavery and not lose her dignity, and really wanted to understand better the similarities between the position of Jesus as a poor Jew in Palestine and how it was very much connected to the vast majority of Negroes in the United States at the time. And so there are some very telling excerpts from this book, such as no external force, however great or overwhelming, can at long last destroy a people if it does not win this victory of the spirit against them. So basically, Thurman in this book talks about Jesus, and then he has a chapter on what is it that Jesus is basically saying in the Gospels that might be something that might be uplifting and offer courage to people with their backs against the wall. He also said that there were three things: fear, hypocrisy or deception, and hatred, the three hounds that trailed the track of the disinherited, that they need not have power over them. So basically, he was very interested in why is it that people seem to need to have lots of weapons and things to hold people into place. And why are they holding people into place anyway? He also says about Jesus, he recognized with authentic realism that anyone who permits another to determine the quality of his inner life gives into the hands of the others the key to his destiny. This was really important. And it's one of the things that I've also been using in working with many of my directees through this pandemic year, multiple pandemic year, because it's like, who's in control of your inner life? Is it you? Is it God? Is it the television? Is it who can throw you off your equilibrium? So if a man knows precisely what he can do to you or what epithet he can hurl against you in order to make you lose your temper, your equilibrium, then he will always keep you under subjection. So basically, Thurman is saying that Jesus was trying to work with the inward center of the people that he preached to, and to help them to understand that they could be free. Regardless of their circumstances, they could be free at an inner place. Their spirits could be free. And he thought this was really important, particularly for people who live in fear. That's one of the characteristics of being a disinherited or dispossessed person. You can think about all the people who are considered illegal aliens or immigrants in the United States now. Along with, Black people who feel like they can't drive down the street for fear that something might happen. So there's this sort of overriding terror. And his feeling was that one of the ways to sort of stabilize oneself is to remember that you are a holy child of God, and that is a given. You don't have to earn that. It is what you are because God created you. He also talks a bit about deception and hypocrisy. That is really giving unmerited flattery to people who happen to be in power. I always like to call this the sort of buttering up your boss kind of component to it. That you are trying to be nice to somebody, even though they may be treating you with abuse, because you want to get maybe a higher raise or whatever. And basically what Thurman is suggesting, that Jesus is suggesting, that you need to go to the source. There's no need for you to have to manipulate somebody into getting you something that you need. You go to God, and then you see where it's going to show up. And that actually requires, however, radical trust and a lot of listening. I think sometimes people kind of miss that, but it does call for those kinds of spiritual skills that you have to cultivate over time. And of course, he talks also about hate, that people, living in oppressed situations begin to develop a certain bitterness towards those that happen to be in charge. And so he, of course, said that Jesus rejected hatred because he saw that hatred meant death to the mind, death to the spirit and death to the communion with his Father. He affirmed life, and hatred was the great denial. And he talks at length about how hatred, no matter who's spewing the hatred, really dries up the creative aspects of a person, that it just uses that kind of energy. And that it is important because, as he says, to revile because one has been reviled. This is the real evil, because it is the evil of the soul itself. So in his final chapter, which is really about love, he says, yes, it takes an enormous amount of cultivation of one's spirit to love someone, to love one's enemy. But that in part, you have to be able to uproot some of that betrayal. And he felt like that it was very important for people to understand that usually if people are spewing hate or trying to oppress people, perhaps it's because they don't know that they are holy children of God. And that part of the call is to love that person into knowing that they're a holy child of God. So what I can say is that it is a tall order, to say the least. We also know that Thurman has a beautiful meditation, which I'm going to play now, about dreams, because I think it's connected to his relationship to Martin Luther King Jr.
As long as a man has a dream in his heart, he cannot lose the significance of living. It is a part of the pretensions of modern life to traffic in what is generally called realism. There is much insistence upon being practical, down to earth. Such things as dreams are wont to be regarded as romantic, or as a badge of immaturity, or as escape hatches for the human spirit. Man cannot continue long to live if the dream in the heart has perished. It is then that they stop hoping, stop looking, and the last embers of their anticipations fade away. The dream in the heart is the outlet. It is one with the living water welling up from the very springs of being, nourishing and sustaining all of life. Where there is no dream, the life becomes a swamp, a dreary, dead place. And deep within, a man's heart begins to rot. The dream need not be some great and overwhelming plan. It need not be a dramatic picture of what might or must be someday. It need not be a concrete outpouring of a world-shaking possibility of sure fulfillment. Such may be important for some, such may be crucial for a particular moment of human history. But it is not in these grand ways that the dream nourishes life. The dream is the quiet persistence in the heart that enables a man to ride out the storms of his churning experiences. It is the exciting whisper moving through the aisles of his spirit, answering the monotony of limitless days of dull routine. It is the ever-recurring melody in the midst of the broken harmony and harsh discords of human conflict. It is the touch of significance which highlights the ordinary experience, the common event. The dream is no outward thing. It does not take its rise from the environment in which one moves or functions. It lives in the inward parts. It is deep within, where the issues of life and death are ultimately determined. Keep alive the dream, for as long as a man has a dream in his heart, he cannot lose the significance of living.
Amen. To cut that one a little short. Uh, so let me just say that there are many links between Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr. There is the rumor that Daddy King or Martin Luther King's father went to school with Howard Thurman, but it's really true that his father actually finished up his studies while Howard Thurman was at Morehouse College. However, Howard Thurman's wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, and Martin Luther King's mother, Alberta King, were actually roommates in high school at a residential school called the Spelman Seminary. But initially, King met Howard Thurman on the page as he read Jesus and the Disinherited while he was in seminary. And he was so inspired by this book that I think it created in him the blueprint for how to help people to sort of develop the vitality and the desire to change things. Thurman also mentored a number of people, Jesse Jackson and Verdon Jordan, and the list goes on and on of people who participated in the civil rights movement. He was really sort of like the spiritual advisor, spiritual director. Some people call him the godfather of the civil rights movement, because not only was this book that King has said carried with him every time he marched, and all of them read Jesus and the Disinherited, but you could see some of his influence in how they trained people in the civil rights movement, which was to center down, calm yourself from the inside before you entered into violent confrontation. And if any of you saw the movie Selma, there's that moment when King is crossing with a number of people, or at least approaching the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He kneels down, takes a moment, prays, and then gets up and turns everybody around. That is sort of one of those moments where we see how these aspects of Thurman's ideas about bringing people together and using Gandhi's ideas about love become part of the civil rights movement. And let me just say that Thurman wasn't an advocate of racial reconciliation because he thought it was the right thing to do. He felt like you could not have union with God without it, because he was one who believed in oneness. And one of the beautiful quote by Vincent Harding says, he was with the movement as a manifestation of this wholeness that he believed in so deeply. He recognized that the movement was doing, what the movement was doing was not simply trying to get laws passed, but trying to bring a new wholeness to American society. And anything that is working for wholeness from his perspective is working for the divine. So Thurman's ideas and attitudes about all of this sort of led to kind of what people are now describing as a sacred activism. And sacred activism is basically when you invite the spirit in for guidance about what to do, when, and how. And we see so many examples of people who have actually done that as they are moving through whatever it is that they need to do at that point in history. And that's why I sort of think of Howard Thurman as a person who is one who operated with inner authority. That is, to protect your inner sanctuary, the inner life, but also to be moving with spirit, to be listening, to utilize spiritual discernment for all decisions, and to cultivate the courage to pay attention. And he says, and I think I will sort of make this one of my final quotes here, which is that we have this movement of spirit that basically the movement of the Spirit of God in the hearts of men and women often causes them to act against the spirit of their times, or causes them to anticipate a spirit which is yet in the making. In a moment of dedication, they are given wisdom and courage to dare a deed that challenges and to kindle a hope that inspires. And so this is why I think that Howard Thurman is really the prototype for a contemplative sacred activist. And, he wrote over 20 books, so there's plenty of things, and you'll be sent also a bibliography to read. He certainly, Jesus and the Disinherited, he's got a wonderful autobiography. I often use his book, Meditations of the Heart, in spiritual direction, but also for my own morning prayer, etc. But he basically set the groundwork for us to understand that it is so important for us to cultivate a spiritual life, to have an active, vibrant spiritual life, and to be able to take that with us as we are being called to fulfill whatever role that we have in God's plan for restoring the beloved creation. I think that was his desire, his dream. And I think he's being able to pass that on, even though it's been nearly 40 years since he's died, that the wisdom that he provides for us is living wisdom, because it's still feeding us now. So I think I'll stop here and maybe give us some time for some questions.
Dr. Brown, thank you so much for your presentation. I wonder, I only recently read Jesus and the Disinherited, and I'll admit that what I did was I listened to it as an audiobook, which was both a wonderful introduction to a very powerful piece of literature and an enormously frustrating experience, because, as you know, the book is so dense that I felt like I just need to stop. I can't just, there's not enough of me to let this wash into me just through my ears, and I need to stop and pick it up in text so I can chew on it a little bit more. Now, I didn't stop. I went ahead and finished it as an audiobook, but it's left me with this hunger to pick it up again. So that was my introduction to Jesus and the Disinherited. I came to know Thurman first through his poetry. And in this age of internet sharing, and you even shared some of his quotations, kind of memeified, if you will, all prettied up for people to understand in bite-sized pieces. I wonder if there are others who are on the call with us who came to know him through the same. There is especially a handful of poems from the mood of Christmas that I really, really love. I Will Light Candles This Christmas is one of them. The work of Christmas, right? When everything is put up, then the work of Christmas begins. I wondered, would you maybe speak a little, if you're able, to the role of poetry in Thurman's life in centering down, in cultivating his spiritual life, in keeping alive the dream in the heart that he spoke of in that last meditation that you played for us?
Yes, so it's unclear where this gift for poetry began, I mean, he was clearly a gifted writer. It was clear from even letters that he wrote to mentors in high school. You know, he was clearly an outstanding student and won all kinds of prizes for writing as well as for oratory. So it's a gift. It's one of his gifts. I mean, you know, who can write that kind of stuff, really? And one of his first publications was in 1944, The Greatest of These. And it's a very difficult book to find. I just stumbled across a copy. But I think that his kind of poetry is the kind that you need to read more than once. You know, I mean, it's like I continue to return to Meditations of the Heart and The Inward Journey. And I mean, I could just go on because they're lyrical, they're beautiful, but they're also the information, the wisdom that it contains. You know, it's kind of one of those things where you just have to read it and then you have to sit, which is why often when I play one of his recitations, I give people a little time to just kind of, you know, sit with what you just heard. So I think that among his gifts, it's almost like it's in its own category, because anyone now can pick up any of his books. There's, and you'll see this on the bibliography, there's a listening room and, you know, digitized sermons from 1951 on, and lectures and public lectures. So what's fascinating though is the combination of the lyrical poetry and his voice, which, you know, he's got a voice. And so, you know, to go along with it. And I think it moves you in some place. And I am also a favorite. The Mood of Christmas and Other Celebrations is one of my favorites as well. And he really makes the case for Jesus's sort of expression of everybody's worthy. You know, Jesus was born in a stable, you know, and, you know, not to prominent parents, etc. And so he's kind of like the person to say, hey, everybody, you know, is of worth because you were created by God. So, and, you know, he also in some parts also talks about the close relationship that he had with Jesus. He used to say, I pray to God, but I talk with Jesus. And and you know, I think in part that book is dedicated to what he says is the spirit that Jesus unleashed in the world. And, you know, that just sort of spirit of love, which is what happens after Christmas, right? It's not just for Christmas. Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Larita, Tom here, and I'm going to put in the chat a list of, from our friends at SMI, who you're going to be with on Tuesday. I want to make sure, because a lot of us are listening to all this and we'd like to keep going, but we can't go all afternoon and evening. But they could come and join in with SMI and the Perkins Spiritual Direction program that are sponsoring a workshop on Tuesday, and spend more time together from contemplation to compassionate social action, the creative encounter of Howard Thurman. That workshop is I put it in the chat for folks if they want the information. And I know we could go all over the place with questions, and a lot of folks. Is it?
Yeah, that's better.
There you go. A lot of folks, Howard Thurman is new to them, especially in the depth and detail that you are bringing to us, and we're so grateful for that. Two Episcopal churches online with you, and people from all over today, but Good Shepherd and Transfig, Episcopal churches, mainline churches, established kind of churches. Also, mainline churches are suspect where we're going to be in the future. But I'm aware that Martin Luther King Jr. gave his last sermon from the National Cathedral, the Episcopal Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And the amount of impact that Thurman had on him, besides Jesus and the Disinherited, this idea of sacred activism. What book by Thurman would you suggest to help form us, to connect us, to link us with the spirituality and social activism?
Well, clearly Jesus and the Disinherited, right? Of course. But
Yes.
I think there's actually a new book out that might be helpful for a lot of people. It's called Anchored in the Current. And it is a collection, Discovering Howard Thurman as Educator, Activist, Guide, and Prophet. It's edited by Gregory Ellison. And so many of the people that have had some contact or connection with Thurman, like Marian Wright Edelman, who is the director of the Children's Defense Fund, she was, influenced by him. And Luther Smith, who actually wrote a lovely book called Howard Thurman, Mystic as Prophet. And it's both kind of a biography, but at the same time sort of connects how he got from, being this contemplative to being one who connected mysticism to social change. And I it's sort of kind of grounded in the idea that mysticism shouldn't just be for you, that it should, and he talks more about this in the Creative Encounter, which I'll talk about on Tuesday, but it's kind of like every time you have an encounter with God, it should move you closer towards oneness or the desire for oneness. And so what are you doing to, what is your call for that? And I think people get confused. Everybody thinks they need to be out in the street. In the civil rights movement, everybody wasn't in the street. There were people who were cooking, people who were taking care of children. There were people who were writing, there were people who were doing all kinds of things behind the scenes, but not everybody was marching. And so in any kind of movement or change or transformation, people have different roles. I'm a double transplant recipient. I don't need to be out in the street and get arrested, right? Can't take medication. But I can do this, right? So I think we're each called to do something, in some kind of way. And, sacred activism isn't just, like I said, about being in the street. You might be a painter, you might be an artist, or you might be a playwright, or, so that your tool becomes your pen, or it becomes your paintbrush, or it becomes something that's going to move people and wake them up to this idea of oneness and connection and love. And so I think that there are, as I've mentioned, those two more recent pieces, but there's also another biography coming out by Peter Eisenstadt called Against the Hounds of Hell. It should be out in the middle of February. And for those who want, just to jump in, the deep end and swim for a long time, there's all 5 volumes of the Howard Thurman Papers Project. So there's plenty of material. And like I said, all of that is on the bibliography, which will be emailed to everybody who, signed up. But I think that I think we need to pay attention to his contemplative leanings, and we can all begin there, which is what are you doing to enhance or cultivate your spiritual life? Do you have a prayer practice? What time, when do you spend time with God? Just, that quiet time. How often do you get outside? When do you ever take a silent retreat? All those kinds of things help to sort of, as Thurman would say, chisel at, these things that keep us chained into thinking that we're in a particular category. He felt like love really couldn't occur unless it was between freed spirits, freed of status, freed of power, freed of race, freed of gender, all those meanings that you might have internalized about that. that perhaps maybe, your authentic self, the one that God created, is none of that. Because as he said, in the presence of God, none of that matters.
We have a couple of quick questions that Rebecca, maybe you want to ask either from Bill or Margaret there.
I'd be happy to. Bill Kessler from Church of the Transfiguration raises the question that Howard Thurman passed away for some 40 years ago, and that when he died, there had already been some retrenching of progress in social transformation. The question being, did he acknowledge that in his writing or teachings toward the end of his life? Did he have, what were his thoughts and statements about that? Or was he less concerned about political transformation? But I think the answer is he probably had a lot to say about it. I'm going to let you answer that.
So I would probably say that, yes, he saw a lot, and he was amazed at some of it. I think for him, he would have wanted things to go even further. Seeing more of people coming together more frequently, particularly in church. He does acknowledge that. He says that, all of these things are wonderful, but if we don't change hearts, we can change all the laws in the world, but if we don't change people's hearts, we're still stuck. So, but after Martin Luther King Jr. died, he wrote In Search of Common Ground. That was, probably one of the books kind of like in response to that. But I think that he when he left Boston, he continued his ministry. And there are a number of recordings of interviews with him, where he talks a little bit more about the transformations in society. But he was really, his deepest desire was to see people move towards getting rid of these barriers that keep people apart. He just saw them as unnecessary and preventing people from having genuine relationships, genuine conversations, that were equal, not one person over the other, but just two human spirits having a connection.
This actually leads pretty well into one of the other questions. Someone asked if you would speak to his commitment to cross-racial worship and church congregations, and that is, that's getting to the heart of what you just were talking about. We've got to change hearts.
Yes.
So how do we change people's hearts? Well, maybe we could begin by worshiping together.
Yes. Well, of course, his big experiment, which is, of course, in the 1940s, he goes to San Francisco and he starts this interracial, interdenominational, interreligious, everything, right? So they had all kinds of people at this church. I think Eleanor Roosevelt was a member at large. You had people, who were Christians, some people who were not. There's one story where he says, this gentleman comes up to him and he says, if I just close my eyes, I feel like I'm in a Buddhist temple. But there's a book about that, by the way, Footprints of a Dream, the story of the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples. And because he felt like, we're all worshiping the same God. Why can we not worship together? And to perhaps maybe create those situations where churches can come together, but where is the courage to step out of your box and invite somebody? That's what he would probably say. So what's keeping you from extending that invitation to some other church that might be in your city, to have a joint worship service?
For sure. Tom?
Well, thank you. And thanks, Rebecca. And thank you so much. I wish we could keep going. But Tuesday is coming. And Monday night also, there's a showing of Backs Against the Wall with the Retreat House here in Dallas, if you just check in with them. I think you would like to close a particular way. You walk us through that as well.
Well, Reverend Tom, I think you have a copy of a meditation that I wanted, and people will receive this as well, that I wanted you to read. It's called The Strength to Be Free. And it's all about being free. So perhaps maybe you could read that to us.
Sure.
And first, I just want to say, before you do that, I just want to say thanks to all of you who joined us on this Sunday afternoon. I so appreciate being a part of this and being able to bring some information, some teaching, some wisdom of Howard Thurman. He's really been such an affirmation and confirmation for me that as a contemplative, I wasn't weird or strange, that, you know, there were other people like me out there that were walking around on the street and not necessarily in a convent or a monastery. So I really am just delighted to continue to expose him to more people who may not know about him and have not had the pleasure of listening to his voice.
Thank you.
Okay, Tom Hotchkiss.
I will, from Meditations of the Heart, you can hear me okay now?
Yes.
Strength to be free. Give me the strength to be free. The thought of being free comes upon us sometimes with such power that under its impact we lose the meaning that the thought implies. Often, being free means to be where we are not at the moment, to be relieved of a particular set of chores or responsibilities that are bearing heavily upon the minds, to be surrounded by a careless rapture with no reminders of costs of any kind, to be on the open road with nothing overhead but the blue sky and whole days in which to roam. For many, being free means movement, change, reordering. To be free may not mean any of these things. It may not involve a single change in a single circumstance, or it may not extend beyond one's own gate, beyond the four walls in the midst of which all of one's working hours and endless nights are spent. It may mean no surcease from the old familiar routine and the perennial cares, which have become one's persistent lot. Quite possibly, your days mean the deepening of your rut, the increasing of your monotony, and the enlargement of the areas of your dullness. All of this and more may be true for you. Give me the strength to be free. Often to be free means the ability to deal with the realities of one's situation so as not to be overcome by them. It is the manifestation of a quality of being and living that results not only from understanding of one's situation, but also from wisdom in dealing with it. It takes no strength to give up, to accept the shackles of circumstance so that they become the shackles of soul, to shrug the shoulders in bland acquiescence. This is easy, but do not congratulate yourself that you have solved anything. In simple language, you have sold out, surrendered, given up. It takes strength to affirm the high prerogative of your spirit. And you will find that if you do, a host of invisible angels will wing to your defense, and the glory of the living God will envelop your surroundings, because in you, he has come into his own.